Okay, well, good evening, and thank you very much for joining me this evening on this webinar on mirror retraining in BDD. My name's Rob Wilson. I am a cognitive behaviour therapist, and I'm also fortunate enough to be the chair of the BDD Foundation. My hope today is to talk you through some of the thoughts about mirrors in BDD, quite an important topic for an awful lot of people, and hopefully share with you some ideas on how to manage them, be it that you're maybe in a place where you're using them a little excessively for checking and examining, or be it that you're avoiding them at the moment. As we go along, I'll ask, please, if you have any questions, if you can put them in the Q&A box, and I will try and get to those as we go, or at least I'll save some time, hopefully, at the end of today's session. Just see a couple of things pop up in the chat. Okay. Good. So why is mirror use an important topic in BDD? Well, obviously the big thing is that there are mirrors and reflective surfaces of all kinds, such as people call the black mirror, around us everywhere we go. And I can remember chatting to someone many years ago who was telling me that she was having particular difficulty at work because she would catch her reflection in the mirrored strips on the shelves in the room that she was working, the shop that she was working at. So it really reminded me that wherever you go, there's always going to be some form of mirror reflective surface. And one of the things I often do when I'm teaching about BDD is I send participants off to go and do what I call a reflective surface hunt, and to look around their room or their office and tell me how many reflective surfaces they can find. And it's usually 20, 30 different reflective surfaces. So navigating those, if you're in a place, even when you're trying to avoid mirrors, can be tricky. And of course, it does provide lots of opportunities to maybe check and scrutinize your appearance. But we know that even people without BDD, mirrors can really increase dissatisfaction in appearance and increase distress. So it's not just a feature for people with body dysmorphic disorder. It's a dimension of life for most people. The mirrors are quite tricky. And the other area, obviously, there's quite a bit of literature about mirrors, mirror checking and things, is eating disorders. And there's been some of the, therefore, and so a little bit of the literature on mirror use, mirror exposure, mirror retraining is a bit muddied in some ways because quite a lot of the studies have combined participants with BDD and eating disorders. And I'm not saying that's a bad thing, and I'm not saying it's a good thing necessarily. I think there are some differences in the way that BDD and ED work to some extent, but we know that both individuals with BDD and individuals with ED do sort of look at themselves differently in the mirror, and they use mirrors differently than the average person on the street. And so that's going to be one of the really key things to pay attention to is how you use the mirror if you have BDD, and see what we could do to kind of make that journey back to using the mirror as if you don't have BDD, and working obviously as part of that being part of the journey to get you to a place where you no longer would say reach criteria for BDD. So that preoccupation with your appearance is below an hour a day, that you don't have significant levels of distress, that you have to function and get on with other the important areas of your life. And to that extent, whilst we all have complaints and concerns about flaws in our appearance, that BDD is no longer actually a problem. And so one of the things we know that people with BDD do is they use mirrors to scrutinize their appearance, to examine to try and assess. You'll see people with BDD lean into a mirror. You'll see them change angles. You'll see them maybe adjust in certain lighting. And it's as if a mirror has become an area for examination rather than a sort of functional unit to just see that if you're me, that toothpaste all over your face or something. And I've always been rather curious to try and figure out what my own psychological reaction is to see myself in the mirror when I maybe go to the loo and wash my hands or something. And I think quite often it's something like, well, oh, you again. But it's not, at least most of the time, I'm not using the mirror as an agent for examination. And I think that's one of the important things to think about BDD is that maybe we've all got experiences where, before an interview or a date night or something, you may spend a lot more time examining your appearance and changing hair, changing makeup, changing clothing, and so on. And so it's not that the average person never has moments when they're quite anxious in front of a mirror, spending more time in front of the mirror and doing that kind of scrutinizing and checking and examining thing. But BDD seems to have taken a moment which should happen kind of every now and then and scaled it up to something which is happening a lot of the time, if not all of the time. So about 90% of individuals with BDD report spending excessive amounts of time in front of the mirror. And it's also really important that we don't just think of it in terms of mirror checking, but also, or mirror gazing as people call it, but also because people swing sometimes between using the mirror a lot to check and assess and scrutinize. And some people then will swing into avoiding. And in fact, that you might think of that as happening in different phases of someone's journey through BDD, but also it can happen at different times of the day, so that you might find that people will spend a lot of time using the mirror to try and fix their appearance in some way, adjusting their hair, makeup, clothing, concealers, things like that, or even practicing facial expressions and stuff. But once that's done, then oftentimes you find that people will then want to avoid seeing their appearance in the mirror because they don't want, if they've got to a place where it's sort of all right and things are fixed, they don't want to see their reflection in an hour or two's time in case it disrupts things. It kind of activates their BDD and activates questions about how do I look. And then, so you can kind of you can switch within the space of a few minutes from a kind of examining in the mirror mode to avoiding mode. And many of you listening now probably all know this better than I do, but these are the kinds of things we want people to understand, that BDD is a complex problem, and that actually even body image in BDD is quite unstable in some ways. One of the other things that's really different about BDD, say, compared to OCD, which is a problem that BDD is often associated with, is that in OCD, say someone's checked their front door a few times, or they've washed their hands to a certain extent, what we call the termination criteria or stopping criteria for that compulsion is that they do these things in OCD oftentimes till you feel a certain amount of relief. So I wash my hands and eventually I'll feel like I've decontaminated them off and there's a certain amount of relief. But in BDD, we know that with mirror checking, that doesn't happen. People don't get much relief. If anything, it gives you the reverse. It causes a lot of distress. About 10% of people with BDD describe having had a panic attack when they've looked in the mirror at certain times. I was actually surprised that figure wasn't a little bit higher. But it also activates emotions like disgust, uh, anxiety. So it doesn't provide relief, and it consumes a lot of time. And a lot of people stop um, looking in the mirror and examining themselves or trying to fix things at the point at which they've either run out of time and the pressure's so high, they just feel so terrible they kind of need to stop. So it's not a comfortable process, and of course it isn't anything to do with being vain or enjoying the experience. It's actually very distressing. And as many of you probably already know, David Phil, a model about BDD, which he calls self as an aesthetic object, which I think does nicely capture at least some components of BDD, in the sense that it means we're treating our appearance like we would treat a picture or a vase or a sculpture or something. Because there's that objectification, that examining, that scrutinizing, which of course is part of fueling preoccupation. Because this mirror use can take several hours of the week, if not of the day, for a lot of people, and of course drives a lot of dissatisfaction. So it is an important topic, and it's part of this process. It's the problem here is the attention's narrowing down onto details and flaws. So remember this is a really important finding from research about individuals with BDD, is that people with BDD have an above average ability to tune into detail. It's almost like a kind of superpower, but that seems to have come at the cost of global processing. So it's not even, to an extent, it isn't even something that you're choosing. Particularly if you've had BDD for a while, you won't be choosing necessarily to pay close attention to details and flaws. It will be sort of how your brain works. And we think it then takes quite a bit of training to get your brain to practice taking in the kind of global impression of how you look. So I was trying to think about how that might work to explain why people's impression of their appearance is so oftentimes is quite distorted. And in a way, I think it's a bit like imagining that you're trying to build a Lego model, say, because you can get Lego models now, not just cars, but you get it of flowers. Or someone showed me the other day a Lego model that she'd made out of, she'd made a Lego model of the galaxy, I think it was. But if your eye is drawn to specific parts of your appearance, I would say it's a bit like thinking about it as each moment that's spent attending to that particular part of your, let's say, your face. It's a bit like you're building and taking a Lego brick for every moment that's spent staring at that part of your face. And if you imagine then you've got bits of your appearance which are only getting scant attention and scant time, so they get very limited bricks, and bits of your appearance which are getting lots of attention, lots of scrutiny, and lots of time, which is they're getting their multiple bricks. Each moment gives you a brick. The picture that's going to be built up is going to be out of kilter. If I'm spending all of my time, if I'm trying to build a Lego a car, but my eye is drawn excessively to the wing mirror, and I'm therefore many bricks going to the wing mirror or to the wheels, and many bricks going into the wheels, but that's become out of proportion to the amount of attention I'm spending to the, say, the bonnet or the overall structure of the car, then the car is going to end up looking out of balance and sort of disfigured. So it's really important to think about that. I'm not sure what everyone makes of that analogy. It's kind of wee small hours of the morning. But it's a way of trying to understand how these attentional processes and preoccupation processes might have an input into building, because we don't, what we see in our mind's eye it's not beamed into the back of our head, it's constructed. Even what I'm seeing in front of me now, the computer screen I'm looking at, is been going through the rods and cones in my eyes. It's been turned into data. My brain's interpreting that data, and it's building this image that I think I'm looking at, but in fact I'm experiencing as it's something I'm actually essentially being constructed in my brain. All of that leads us to the point that one of the things we really want to try and help people to do when we're working with mirrors is to dilute down this very narrow attention and boost this broader, more impression-based attention to try and balance the image, balance the Lego, so that it doesn't end up distorted, becomes more realistic. And I think that's why many people find that they only get a much better impression of how they look when their BDD is much, much better. And I think that's because all of the processes that are kind of loading up the system, that appearance impression system, by the time BDD is much better, those are settled and they're much more balanced, and you get, therefore your brain is able to construct a much more natural, more realistic impression. So this is an important input. Isn't the only input, but it can be an important input to eventually get to a place where you feel far happier with your appearance. So something to think about for yourselves is what are you using or any other mirror or any other reflective surface for? Because we want to really, any problem solving is only ever really as good as how well you've defined it. So are you using it for checking purposes? Are you using it to measure things? Are you somehow analyzing the texture or the tone of your skin? Are you analyzing how you feel certain body parts compare against someone else's or against your ideal? Are you trying to figure out how you think your appearance could be fixed or improved? Are you spending time trying to imagine what you would say to a cosmetic or aesthetic practitioner or something, dermatologist, if you were there in front of them? How would you describe what you want improved? Are you thinking, so that's about kind of planning towards correcting. Are you using mirrors for correcting, concealing, applying makeup, readjusting your hair, changing clothing and things? Are you using, so we know that people sometimes will practice trying to hold their body or hold their face in a certain expression, because again, it's almost as if you're doing some inner aesthetic work. When you trying to practice which angles you're going to let people see your appearance and not which angles you want to try and conceal. Are you trying out mirrors in different lightings so that you can kind of get a sense of what you feel is most revealing and most sympathetic? The point being partly here, of course, is that mirrors are a complicated and complex experience. And again, part of me realizes sitting here today that I'm sort of preaching to the choir, because many of you would know a lot more about this experience than I do. But I'm also partly wanting to help people who perhaps don't have BDD to understand that it's not a case of imagined ugliness. This is a case of a complex disorder with a lot of activity in it. And there is a reason that perfectly sensible, perfectly decent looking people get to a place where they feel their appearance is really ugly or disgusting or flawed. And that's because there's a lot of activity going on. The reason I think it's important, if you have BDD, to really think about all those activities is that each activity that you can put your finger on potentially becomes a point of intervention, gives you something to think, what if I'm excessively checking, if I'm leaning in, if I'm zeroing in on a certain flaw, if I'm using, rather than the mirror as just there as a sort of functional object, I'm using it to analyze, to spend too much time concealing, planning for my corrections and so on, then these are things I can start to put my finger on and start to counter and start to kind of correct for. And these are all going to be inputs into breaking free from the problem. Quite a few years ago now, David Beale and Susan Riley did an interesting piece of research looking at the motivations that people have for what they call I think it was what they called then was mirror gazing. And this is quite an important area too, is to realize that our brains don't do things for us like no reason, and they don't even do them just for kind of reflex or as compulsions. Um, they they may end up being sort of like a habit and something that almost happens by reflex, but it may often behind it there may be some motivations or what's sometimes called metacognitions. Um, but these really is best understood just as thoughts that help you understand kind of why you do a particular activity, in this case, mirrors, looking at mirrors. and again, it's something else I would encourage you to try and understand for yourselves if you have BDD and you want to work on this problem, is do any of these apply to you, or are there slightly tweaked versions of these, like, or very different versions that you would put your finger on that you can understand as your motivation for checking or gazing or scrutinizing the mirror? So these examples, like the hope that I might look different when I first look in the mirror, the hope that I can feel comfortable with my appearance. So it's interesting. Again, one of the other things to always bear in mind is your brain is usually trying to help you in some way. So here we've got a couple of items here which are about trying to generate hope. Then we have some items here like which are more about intolerance of uncertainty, like I have to know what I look like, and I can't until I look in the mirror. So it's a kind of, it's a checking behavior, but it's, you may be aware that more recently in the whole kind of field of anxiety disorders and obsessional problems in particular, that tolerance of uncertainty is quite a big deal. I can make myself look better or hide myself. So again, we're looking at kind of concealing and camouflaging things. I look in the mirror to see how I feel. I have to know for certain how I appear in public. I have to make myself look the best. I mean, I don't mean appear the best that there's ever been. I mean, the best I can achieve in my appearance. I believe if I stare long enough, I might see a different image. If I resist looking in the mirror, then I'll feel worse, which is an interesting thought, given how much worse looking in the mirror tend to make people. I need to see what I don't like about myself. And again, it's oftentimes there are reasons for that, so that people think, well, I need to know what I don't like about myself so that at least I'm aware and I don't suddenly get caught out by someone else saying something to me. Or I need to see what I don't like so I can figure out how I'm going to get someone to fix it, maybe. I need to see what I like about myself to try and bring about a bit of balance. And so that I need to use a mirror to make myself look presentable, which I guess is probably more similar than the average person on the street, that people do use mirrors to make themselves look a bit more presentable. But again, I think there might be a difference here in terms of intensity, the amount of time that's spent. But it's worth trying to have a stab at what you feel is your own motivation for mirror use, and also similarly for what your own motivation might be for avoiding mirrors. And then it can also be helpful even to look at, just go through a costs and benefits of how helpful is this really. Remember, one of the big issues in BD is it's a problem of extreme self-consciousness. And you get to feel self-conscious because your attention is focused in upon you. And mirrors are a cheat because on the one hand, it sort of looks like you're looking outward, but of course, in looking at a mirror, your attention is bouncing back and it's coming back on you. And the more self-conscious you are, the more likely you're to feel awkward and uncomfortable in or out of social situations, but obviously within social situations as well. And if you're highly self-conscious within a social situation, you're much more likely to infer that people are thinking critically of you. Just seems to be the way the brain works. So, of course, what we want is a goal of being more what they call field attention, kind of outwardly looking attention. And so that's the other thing we're going to try and bear in mind about mirror use, is can we use mirrors in a way which helps us to externalize the focus of our attention? So this is slightly some statements in the obvious, but it's worth thinking about some of these ideas, because working on any aspect of BDD can be pretty tough. Working on changing the way your brain, mind, and you together kind of use, sort of say it that way, because we have some influence over our brain directly, but some of it happens kind of on autopilot. We have to sort of work hard to train it. But all those jobs are hard, so really galvanizing your motivation. When you think about the time and distress caused by scrutinizing yourself in the mirror, how helpful is it? How much does it improve your concerns about your appearance? How much has this helped you with your friendships, relationships, hobbies, interests, work, and education? Would you recommend the way you use mirrors to a dear friend or a loved one? Do you think, looking back on your life, when you're old and grey, I wish I'd spent more time in front of the mirror? Or do you think there's a chance that you might spend, when you're older, look back and wish you'd done something different with your time? And that's one of the questions I think we should all think about sometimes is, are we in line with our values? Are we living life in a way that we're going to really look back and be satisfied with, or various things, different pressures, worries, anxieties, and so on, pulling us off track? Many of you will also know that we like a diagram in CBT, and one of the diagrams we use is this thing called a vicious flower. Vicious flower is something we use to try and map out people's problems. And all a vicious flower is, of course, is a bunch of vicious circles all clustered together, looking at different parts of how the problem is working, so we can try and help people to understand how it's being maintained. If people understand how things are being maintained, then the hope is then that's going to help them to then figure out what the route out might be. So, of course, in this particular dimension, we're looking at two kind of key areas where you're focusing your attention and where you're checking, because these are obviously two areas that are important in BDD. And the other area, of course, about mirrors is the flip side of this, which is what's the effect of avoiding mirrors? Because mirror avoidance is going to be, as I already said, is going to be a part of the issue, and we'll talk a little bit later about how to start, maybe try and break through some of that. And so oftentimes when you're starting this journey of recovery in any area, you need to try and check in, are there any ideas that your brain is going to pop up with? Because it's going to keep trying to protect you, because a big part of our brain's job is to try and keep us safe. Is to try and understand if there's any ideas that are going to kind of try and maybe get in the way, what we might think of as kind of recovery interfering ideas, things like, but I need to be sure of how I look. The main solution, surely, to feel better really, is to change how I look, because I'm worried about flaws. If I got rid of the flaws, and that's the reason I wouldn't worry so much. Although anybody who's been through that process will tell you it doesn't often work very well. The solution for me is to be persuaded that I have BDD, or to be persuaded that I look better than I do. There's this idea that somehow that should be the job of family, friends, or even therapists to kind of, or cosmetic surgeons or whoever, to kind of, if they can tell me enough of the right things, then they might be able to change my mind. The flip side of that oftentimes is then people are often afraid that people like me and therapists and so on might try and pull the wool over your eyes. So it's quite hard to win. So we've got something to do is just to try and notice what kind of doubts and reservations your mind might have about changing parts of your BDD, and at least just be aware of them. Because remember, the idea is that there in CBT we think about this as sort of theory A, which is the problem is my appearance, and therefore the solution lies in changing my appearance. Or then we've got theory B, which is the idea that the problem is a psychological problem of some kind, a worry problem, a preoccupation problem. And so the principle of being here that recovery is about testing out and seeing what happens if you tackle the problem as if it's a psychological one. Remember, it is extremely unlikely, if you start off with a problem that's convinces you you've got a problem with your appearance, it is extremely unlikely you're going to suddenly be able to jump to believing wholeheartedly the problem is a psychological one. So we're not asking for that sudden shift in belief. What we're asking for is, what we're suggesting is to try out seeing what happens if you treat the problem as if it's a psychological one. But that does mean giving that a fair chance by really committing to strapping on your inner psychologist, getting in touch with your inner psychologist. And I was just trying to think, what is the outfit of a psychologist these days, but I might leave that. It's not Freud's pipe anymore, I don't think. But anyway, what that means is thinking about changing psychological processes. If you're going to treat the problem as if it's a psychological problem, it means locking down into, it doesn't just mean changing what you believe about your appearance. That is the sort of tip of the iceberg. Underneath all the tip of the iceberg are these processes like attention biases, checking behaviors, comparing, and other things like the way you use mirrors. And there are all these processes which are going to be maintaining your preoccupation with your appearance. And then there's going to be a bunch of avoidance behaviors that are happening around your appearance, maybe avoiding certain social situations and certain proximities to people, wearing certain kinds of clothing, being seen without certain safety behaviors in place, and so on. And so the other side of recovery from BDD, of course, is alongside dropping these maintaining mechanisms that keep the problem alive and kicking, is reclaiming your life, lots of exposure to feared and avoided situations, so you can reclaim or build back up your life and really increase that range of rewarding and satisfying and even challenging but meaningful experiences. But the reason I still flag up the vicious flower is it's quite important that you go through the process of trying to understand, there are these behaviors that I carry out, and how are they working for me? My therapist, or I've read in a book that checking's bad for you, comparing's bad for you. Rob seems to be saying that scrutinizing yourself in the mirror is bad for you in some way, but what's important is that if you're really going to get behind changing these processes, to think through for yourself, what is the effect of this? And another way of doing that, so you can use the vicious flower, which is just a vicious circle, going through the behavior and the unintended consequences. But another way of doing this is this triple column, no, thankfully I can stand still count, the quadruple column of what we call a functional analysis. And a functional analysis is the old behavioral ABC, antecedents, behavior, and consequences. And that means what came before the behavior, what is the behavior, and we're interested in two things. What was your intended consequence, but actually what actually happened? Was there an unintended consequence? So be interesting to get you to think about, if my intended consequences, I've noticed, I'm walking down the corridor, seeing the bathroom at work, thoughts flashed into my mind. Oh, put concealer on earlier on, but I wonder if it's worn off. Let me just go and check and reapply it, because my plan is that if I do that, my hope is I'll put my mind at rest, so then I can just get that worry off my mind and focus on getting on with my work. I'd be curious to know what you guys think might be the unintended consequences. And in fact, by all means, if anyone's got any thoughts about that, feel free to throw them into the chat. But it's likely to be things like, well, I intended to have this taken off my mind, but actually I got stuck in the mirror, still didn't feel happy with what I saw. Actually now, as we've mentioned, my distress and so on has gone up. Now I've noticed another flaw that I didn't really feel so happy with, and things look a bit different in this light than they did at home, so it may raise more questions. So the likely unintended consequence of going in and checking and reapplying the concealer is that I've ended up being more concerned about my appearance, more dissatisfied, and probably my mood is actually shaken. So it hasn't paid off to even put my mind at rest. I probably had to tear myself away from the mirror thinking, I've just got to get back to work and get on with it. But I really feel fed up. And so something to do to help yourself understand the way your problem works and to really boost your motivation to change is to take this simple 4-column table, and I would say run a week or two of capturing moments where you've engaged in particular activities related to your appearance. Particularly, obviously today we're focusing on mirror checking, or it could be mirror avoidance, that you've gone well out of your way to avoid mirror, or you've had to throw something over the mirror. What was happening? What did you do? What was the plan? What was the hope? And how did it actually play out? So you've got really great data that tells you a lot about the way your problem works, that then you can make your own really well-informed choices about what to do differently. But you also learn by making a note of when and where the problem arises. It will give you some data on the kinds of places and situations and people to go ahead and tackle differently. So if in this sense, I think it could be a lot like if anyone's ever worked on things like skin picking and hair pulling, you spend always a week or two just monitoring before you start intervening. And this can be worth it. It's always, again, that principle of if you've got a really good idea of how the problem is, then your solutions are likely better because they're better informed. And so you may find it's more effective. Really have basically 4 choices, really. Carry on as you are. You could try and switch just to doing it like normal, like as you believe, using mirrors as you believe the average person on the street. You could do what some people do, which is go ahead and cover up mirrors so they stop causing you trouble. Or you could deliberately practice go through some strategies to try and counter those current patterns and actually get in there and do what we call kind of the anti-BTD work. And and part of the problem is here that sometimes covering mirrors can work very, very briefly to interrupt a kind of very, very powerful pattern of mirror checking or feeling completely dominated by mirrors. But most people find that's a very, very temporary solution, doesn't teach them a lot. And obviously switching to normal, if you could just suddenly switch to normal, then BD probably wouldn't be the problem we think it is. And for most people, it's much, much harder than that. It's got wedded into your habit mechanisms and it's into the threat system and so on. It's a bunch of powerful processes that are keeping it going. So we tend to need to go for option 4. And option 4, you can be guided by kind of where are you trying to get to in the long run. So you sort of set yourself a goal, like what do you think your BDD free to win would do? What do you remember? How do you remember using your mirrors before you developed BDD? If you can remember that, some of us find it difficult. Some people find it difficult because it came on in adolescence and it's hard to cast your mind back pre-adolescence. Can you pick a healthy role model to follow? Or you might even just do a short survey with some friends and family about how do they use mirrors? How long do they spend? What kind of activities do they do? What reasons do they use mirrors for? How do they react when they see a mirror? These kinds of things. And that can give you really interesting data to help you to set your goal for your healthy mirror use. But we're not really expecting you to jump straight there. But as I say, try and map out what you think the intention would be. Is it for assessment, or is it just to see whether you look a complete scruff? Are you using it for tasks like brushing your hair or brushing your teeth or makeup application, or is it being used as a checking process in itself? When someone's using mirrors healthy, where is their attention focused? How long do they spend? How close to the mirror do they get? These kind of interesting things you can try and scope out in a survey if you want to know a bit more about how friends and family do it. can be useful. It can feel like a lot of preliminary stuff, but it can give you an idea, a bit like setting a sat nav, about where your destination is and be clear about where you're heading to. You may not be able to jump there yet, a bit like because you don't have a time traveling machine or a kind of teleportation device, you have a car. There's going to be a journey, but it's helpful still to be clear on the destination. So I'm going to talk about a couple of strategies that are worth using. In the literature, there's a principle that's used a lot for eating disorders and sometimes used for BDD called mirror exposure. And that means spending about half an hour or so, a prolonged process of standing in front of the mirror and trying to get used to looking in the mirror. And the idea is that it's seeing yourself in the mirror a bit like someone would, if it's like a phobic object, like a spider or heights or something. So this is particularly apt for people where mirror avoidance is a dominant process. There is a question in the literature, and it's a question I would validate about whether mirror exposure outside of people who have high levels of mirror avoidance, whether it's necessarily that useful a strategy, or is it better to learn how to become detached from mirrors, which again I'll talk a bit more about. But it needs to be done in a controlled and prolonged way, and it needs to be done without scrutinizing, leaning in, narrowing down the focus of attention. It's got to be done with response prevention, but it's also got to be done with a lot of caution, because there is in the literature quite a number of cautionary tales about people getting very upset and very activated by mirror exposure that maybe it's been done too early in treatment, or it's been done perhaps not carefully enough in some way, or without support. So if mirror is extremely activating for you, go carefully. And remember, there's lots of other areas that you can work on to tackle other aspects of your BDD before working towards this, or at least we start in a very graded way. And I'll talk a bit more about grading in a second. But in the main, for most people, the energy you want to put into your exposure and response prevention, I would say, is about reclaiming your life and important places, people, activities that help you to rebuild your life. But when you encounter mirrors, they're going to be something you learn to manage differently. And so that they are like water off a duck's back, rather than something that necessarily really upsets you or draws you in for lots of activity. I asked ChatGPT to try and do me a picture of someone doing mirror training, which it did a half decent job at. Because this leads me on to what I would almost think of as kind of classical mirror retraining. So this is developed by Sabina Wilhelm, and I've taken some of the description from helpful that she and some colleagues did. Description that she and some colleagues did on the IOCDF website. And the idea is that in classic mirror retraining, you're going to ideally use a full-length mirror. You're going to stand a good distance back, at least I would say 3 feet away from the mirror. And the idea is you're going to practice describing your appearance from head to toe in non-judgmental terms. So it's grey, I can't see myself at the moment, but it's grey hair, a couple of inches below my eyebrows, maybe an inch below that my eyes. Lower down, there's a nose in the middle. There's a bit of hair underneath the nose, then there's my lips. And so the idea is you're trying to do 2 things. You're trying to boost by going from head to toe. You're trying to boost that global processing. Remember, we were saying that's moving, trying to balance that attention with detail into more of a global impression is really, really key. But also you're trying to balance that very acute, critical mind that is, I sometimes think of as kind of like BDD FM, or the kind of BDD demon screaming and shouting. You're trying to, at least if you can't stop that, you're almost trying to disrupt it by developing an alternative path. It's a bit like saying there are 2 paths in the cornfield, and instead of always going down the supercritical path, you're going to try and establish there is a a more objective path. We're going to try and walk down that objective path about my appearance to try and strengthen that. But again, it is worth saying that this is, unless your BDD is relatively mild, it's important to have some support in doing this, but or at least to go very, very, very gradually. So you can adjust the lighting, and I've known people to start the processes of things like using mirrors or using a camera on Zoom by having literally by candlelight at the beginning and working toward having the light turned on in the room. I've known people to do this from a very, very long way away, and even then it being quite challenging, but doing a long way away from the mirror. You can think of sometimes wearing certain clothing you feel much more comfortable in as what we would think of as an approach enhancing behavior. So some clothing or even glasses, hats and things, they may be, you can use some of these, what you'd think of in other contexts as sort of safety behaviors, somewhat as what we think of as approach enhancing behaviors, because you're going to use them to start a journey toward reclaiming mirror use, but you're going to do it in a way that's very gradual. So you start off with maybe certain clothing, then change that clothing, you move slowly more closely to the mirror. You maybe you start using a very small mirror from a long distance to get to a full-size mirror or a half-size mirror. So break it down, go steady, remember, and if it's still, when you're doing an exposure process, it needs to be long. It needs to be half an hour or so to give your brain the chance to adjust and acclimatize. And the way to think about some of the non-judgmental stuff that's embedded in mirror retraining, I often thought that it's useful to think about it as if you're trying to describe your appearance to like a police sketch artist or something, so that if you were abducted, people would know who to look for. So it's that you don't describe yourself as, oh, ugly, appalling, oh, just disgusting, someone you wouldn't want to see. You describe it in terms of middle-aged man, grey hair, bit of a beard, that kind of stuff. So so there's some chance you could be recognized. And that's the kind of mindset you're trying to achieve in that more objective mindset. You're really trying to step back. And something else that's not well described in the literature, but I think is really, really key, is to think about, even when you're looking in the mirror, what else can you look at other than yourself? So I think it's possible to, I've had this conversation a lot with people when we talk about how to manage Zoom, is that looking at a mirror, there will be things you can see behind you in the mirror. You can see the mirror itself. There's lots of data points. I can remember working with one man quite a long time ago where we were paying great attention to the tiles in his bathroom as part of helping to, again, where his brain wanted to zero in on his flaws, we were helping to kind of counterweight for that by thinking of not only other areas of his appearance, but other areas that you can see in the room around the appearance. So again, you're trying to boost that kind of stepping back and as if you're zooming out rather than sort of honing in. Just to say, I think that's really worth considering. And what's inevitably going to happen is you're trying to reclaim mirror use, or you're trying to wrangle your mirror use into a more healthy version, is BDD wouldn't be what it is if it didn't activate a bunch of critical or sometimes like a tyranny of critical appearance related thoughts. One of the ways to try and understand that is to try and work with those appearance-related critical thoughts, is to try and be a bit more understanding about it. Try and understand. Sometimes it's helpful to think about it as a bully or the imp, or like it's propaganda. So you've got something to stand up to. Another way of thinking about it can be that you can think, look, brain, I understand we've learned all this stuff through some really difficult processes of people being maybe abusive or bullying and teasing, and you're trying to keep my guard up. You're trying to make sure I don't feel too comfortable about my appearance, so I can't be hurt as badly again. I get it. But do you mind if I just take a step back from this for a minute? I see where you're coming from. I really see you're trying to keep me safe, but I'm just going to try and take a step back. So you don't necessarily argue with the thoughts, but at least you try and understand where they're coming from. Because the place we want to try and get to is the idea that these are inevitable and predictable mental events that you're going to try and allow to happen. But you're not really going to try and argue with them, but also you're not really going to try and buy them. You're going to try and see them as what they are, which is mental events. They're not truths. They're not facts. They're just stuff that's getting activated in your head. And there may be stuff that's being activated in your head for some very good reasons. So one way of trying to do this is just to boost that mixed signal that these are anticipated mental events. Is some people find it helpful just write down the thoughts they know they're going to get when they're approaching the mirror, write them down on a piece of paper, stick them in their back pocket. So it kind of communicates this message that these are predictable mental events. And they're kind of like they're an unwanted party guest. They're going to come. You might as well just let them get on with themselves, because you're not going to try and throw them out of the party. You're just going to try and let them happen. So the idea is these thoughts are going to come. You're going to try and detach and refocus. As I said, you can kind of somewhat disrupt them or try and find an alternative by developing this more, as I say, this kind of police sketch mindset. But try and support the anti-critical thinking by that process of stepping back, that global attention. So it's not all about homing into those flaws and attacking you for those flaws. It's in this ecosystem of a kinder, gentler, more way of trying to broadly look at yourself in the mirror. And so this picture reminds me of that experience of there being, even when you look in the mirror, there are things there, even if it's the sink, even if it's the soap dispenser, even if it's a tap, even if it's the corners of the mirror, and the tiles you can see, or any of the things. If you remind me, bathroom, you could see far too many clothes hanging off things. So there's lots of data points you can still take in behind you to try and expand that attention. Because mirrors, we want them to become so they're part of life. But there could be part of an opportunity to just detach from the things that it activates and resist those, detach from those thoughts and resist those compulsions for examining and scrutinizing. If you do use a mirror, maybe we want that broad global attention. We want it to keep it brief, but we don't want it to be also like it's a hot thing that you're only barely touching. It's going to be something you're going to approach calmly. And again, think about this principle of acting as if you're feeling better. Trying to use mirrors calmly, not to get in and out and escape. The mirrors are there to be used as a tool for helping you to put your makeup on, brush your teeth, and check there's not too much foam around your face, that your hair doesn't look completely ridiculous and sticking out all over the place like mine does in the morning. But it's not there as a tool for assessment and scrutiny or comparing and other things. And remember that it's part of an overall process, that we want this to be just a kind of a link in the chain of the areas that you're working on to overcome your BDD. When your main aim needs to be on getting the functioning back, so you can decrease the amount of time and energy your brain's spending on appearance by boosting the amount of time and energy spending on other things. And so that you're hopefully, what we're moving to is, instead of self as an aesthetic object, it's self as a functional, emotional, fallible, social, philosophical, useful, a human being, not an object. Don't think of other things that you would say were important to make up a person. And that brings me to the end, and I'll look and see if I have any questions I can field. And whilst I'm doing that, though, I'm going to make a little plug, which is that next year on the 16th of May, I and some colleagues are doing the National Three Peaks Challenge, which means climbing 3 mountains in support of the BDD Foundation. It's safe to say I've never climbed a mountain in my entire life, and I'm more than a little nervous about whether my fitness I try and achieve this in my 50s for the first time, whether that's going to be up to scratch. So I'm walking as much as I possibly can at the moment to try and get that fitness up. But if any of you felt able to support that fundraising endeavor, there's a QR code on the screen there, which if you take if you know, use your camera and pick up the link to my fundraising page, I'll be incredibly grateful. But meanwhile, let's have a look if there's any questions I can try and answer. If someone with OCD stops having obsessive thoughts about a body part but still avoids mirrors or checking that area, could that indicate lingering OCD habits or something closer to BDD? So yeah, the hint about whether it's OCD or BDD is really whether it's an aesthetic concern, whether the person, whether it's that drive about appearance. It could be health concerns, where it's more health anxiety, or it could be looking for other evidence of harm or something, I guess, in OCD. But yeah, the clue about whether it's BDD or not is really whether it's related to aesthetics and appearance. But the principles are very similar. They're still about exposure and response prevention and refocusing retention. Another question. I'd like to ask about how you suggest preventing an exercise of using the mirror to view the whole self and not just perceive flaws from reverting back to compulsive BDD checking behavior. That is the big question. That's a great question. The question there is, how do you're trying to do mirror retraining, but how do you stop the brain from turning it into mirror checking? And that is one of the criticisms in the literature on mirror exposure and mirror retraining, is how do you do that? Now, there are two things. One is you go in with a very clear idea about what those anti-BDD things are. So where you're going to look, what that focus of attention is going to be like. So, for example, you try and lock and load quite clearly what your anti-BDD strategies are going to be when you're doing the mirror retraining or mirror exposure. But I would say that for some people it becomes extremely difficult, and if it's really impossible to stop that from activating, you could do one of two things. You can grade it so it's a little easier, or put a pin in it, go work on do the exposure to outside real world situations, and then come back to mirrors. I think it's really important not to put mirrors in some kind of pivotal, overly important area. People make really great recoveries, mainly focusing on exposure to real life and outside world stuff, and where mirrors has been a very low priority in treatment, they still make really good recoveries. Another question, if I may ask, when you were able to answer, why do sufferers of BDD judge ourselves so harshly compared to others? When I look at myself, I see and judge myself so differently to how I look at others. That's definitely a strong feature of BDD. And why? Well, again, I think it's possibly because the brain is trying too hard to keep you safe in certain ways. But it's very much part of BDD. It's really, really common. So if you want to change it, the best way to change it is to look at the overall, as I say, this kind of ecosystem of avoidance behaviors, safety behaviors, self-focused stuff, and all the other areas of preoccupation. And you'll probably find that will decrease, that mental tendency will decrease as overall BDD decreases. Should mirrors be removed from home or perhaps covered up? Only very, very temporarily. There's always hope for BDD. Many people, someone's asking, is there any hope? There's always hope, and many people find they have to have several goes at recovery before they really crack it. So please just keep trying. It really is worth it. I know so many people have been to very dark places with their BDD and still have gone on to make really good recoveries. I guess one more question before I stop. How would you recommend approaching behavioral experiments around mirror use if the behavior is mirror avoidance? Well, I guess I've spoken to that a little bit. But yeah, gradually and really thinking about how you can work out those processes that you're working on and countering them. But I guess I'm afraid, sorry for not being able to answer all those questions. Thank you for the questions that you have asked. And we ought to stop, but thank you so much for joining me this evening, and I hope it's been one or two helpful points in there. And best of luck with anyone who's going to go on and give it some of this a try. Thank you.